Imagine riding your bicycle down an empty, sun-scorched desert highway, just a mile from your front door, and simply vanishing off the face of the earth. No skid marks. No witnesses to a struggle. Just an abandoned bike and, a year later, a horrifying Polaroid photograph of a bound and gagged girl staring blankly from the shelf of a convenience store thousands of miles away. New Mexico is a land of breathtaking horizons, towering mesas, and endless places to hide a secret. Tonight, we walk into the quiet, unforgiving dust of the Southwest to look at the darkest, most baffling unsolved disappearances this state has ever swallowed. Case 1, The Morning Ride of Tara Calico. The morning of September 20, 1988, started out like any other late summer day in Belen, New Mexico. It was crisp, the kind of clear desert morning where the sky stretches out in an unbroken dome of pale blue, promising the intense afternoon heat that would soon bake the Valencia County soil. 19-year-old Tara Lee Calico was a disciplined, active young woman who approached life with focus and energy. She was studying psychology at the University of New Mexico, working part-time at a local bank to save money, and keeping herself in peak physical shape. She loved running, playing sports, and cycling along the paved, dusty roads that bordered her hometown. That morning, Tara planned to take her regular exercise route, a grueling, 17-mile loop down New Mexico State Road 47, a stretch of asphalt locals universally referred to as Old Highway 6. It was a paved, two-lane road that ran roughly parallel to the railroad tracks, slicing through flat, desolate expanses of scrub brush, sand, scattered tumbleweeds, and sparse pinyon pine trees. It was a route she knew intimately, having traveled it dozens of times before without incident. The rhythm of the tires on the asphalt was supposed to be a familiar, comforting routine. Before she left her family home, Tara had made a specific request of her mother, Patty Dole. Knowing that the route could be physically demanding and that afternoon temperatures in the New Mexico desert could climb rapidly, Tara asked her mother to come and look for her along the highway if she had not returned by noon. She had a tennis date scheduled with her boyfriend later that afternoon, and she wanted to make sure she kept her schedule tight. Because her personal Sony Walkman was broken, Tara borrowed her mother's Walkman and popped in a cassette tape of Boston's third studio album to listen to while she rode. She hopped onto her neon-pink Murray Master mountain bike, a bicycle featuring distinctive yellow and black foam hand grips and a cracked rear fender, and pedaled out of the driveway, heading south into the morning sun. She was last seen alive at approximately 11:45 a.m. near the intersection of New Mexico State Road 116 and Old Highway 6. Several independent witnesses caught sight of her as she moved down the road. A local resident named Henry Avila was driving his truck along the highway when he noticed a young woman riding a pink bicycle ahead of him. He remembered her clearly because she was wearing headphones, meaning she likely could not hear approaching vehicle traffic and was keeping close to the right shoulder of the road. Another witness, a retired police officer named Frank Romero, saw her a short time later as he drove along the same route. But Romero noticed something deeply unsettling that Henry Avila had either missed or that had developed moments later. A dirty, light-colored Ford pickup truck, estimated to be a 1953 model equipped with a camper shell, was trailing closely behind her. The truck was creeping along at an abnormally slow speed, matching her pace step for step, effectively boxing her in against the edge of the asphalt. After that second sighting, Tara Calico simply vanished from the physical world. When noon arrived and the minutes began to tick past, Patty Dole honored the promise she had made to her daughter. She got into her car and drove the entirety of the 17-mile route, keeping her eyes fixed on the shoulders of the road, the deep drainage ditches, and the desolate expanses where the desert bled into the distant horizon. She found nothing. No neon-pink bicycle. No cassette tape of Boston music. No discarded headphones. No trace of Tara whatsoever. As the afternoon bled into evening and evening gave way to the freezing blackness of the desert night, panic set in. Hours later, search and rescue teams descended on Belen. Law enforcement officers, county deputies, and volunteers scoured the desert floor using helicopters, all-terrain vehicles, horseback patrols, and specialized tracking dogs. They combed every square foot of the terrain adjacent to Old Highway 6. They found absolutely nothing. There were no skid marks on the road to suggest a sudden collision or a violent swerve. There were no broken glass fragments, no drops of blood, and no personal belongings dropped in the sand. It was as if Tara and her mountain bike had dissolved into thin air. Then, on June 15, 1989, nearly 9 months after she pedaled away from her driveway, a chilling piece of the puzzle surfaced thousands of miles away from the quiet plains of New Mexico. A woman walking through a convenience store parking lot in Port St. Joe, Florida, noticed a discarded Polaroid photograph lying face-up on the sun-baked asphalt near a white Toyota passenger van. She picked it up, turned it over, and froze in horror. The photograph, taken inside what appeared to be the dark, confined space of a cargo van or a railcar, showed 2 bound and gagged individuals, a young woman with light brown hair and a young boy. Their hands appeared to be securely tied behind their backs, and thick, dark duct tape was plastered horizontally across their mouths, sealing them in silence. Lying right beside them on the striped mattress was a mass-market paperback copy of V.C. Andrews' best-selling Gothic novel, My Sweet Audrina. When the photograph was publicized on national television programs, Patty Dole saw it and experienced an instant, visceral shock that only a mother could know. The young woman in the photograph bore a striking, undeniable physical resemblance to Tara. Furthermore, there was a faint scar on the woman's leg that matched an identical scar Tara had received in a childhood car accident. In addition, Patty knew intimately that Tara loved reading V.C. Andrews' novels and frequently carried them with her. Forensic analysts immediately tested the Polaroid to determine its veracity. They established that the photograph must have been taken after May 1989, because the paperback edition of My Sweet Audrina shown in the picture was not released to bookstores across the country until that specific month. Experts from Scotland Yard and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were brought in to analyze the image. The FBI's photographic analysis came back inconclusive, stating the lighting and angle made a definitive identification impossible. However, Scotland Yard analysts concluded with a high degree of certainty that the girl in the photo was indeed Tara Calico. Another independent analysis conducted by the Los Alamos National Laboratory pointed toward authenticity, suggesting the girl in the picture was likely the missing Belen teenager. Yet, despite the explosive national media attention, the appearance of the photo on programs like A Current Affair and Unsolved Mysteries, and decades of police investigation, no one has ever identified the people in that photograph. The driver of the van, the person who dropped it in a Florida parking lot, and the exact geographic location where it was snapped remain entirely unknown. Over the subsequent decades, various tips trickled into the Valencia County Sheriff's Office. In the late 2000s, the sitting sheriff of Valencia County publicly stated that he believed he knew what happened to Tara, that a group of local teenage boys had accidentally struck her with a truck while driving recklessly along the highway, panicked, disposed of her body in an abandoned mine shaft or remote desert grave, and successfully covered up the crime. But no arrests were ever made. No physical evidence was ever recovered to back up the sheriff's claim, and no grand jury indictments were ever handed down. Today, Tara Calico's disappearance remains one of the most haunting and meticulously analyzed cold cases in American history. Her mother passed away without ever knowing the truth of what happened to her eldest daughter, leaving behind a quiet desert highway that still keeps its secrets buried deep beneath the baking New Mexico sun. Before we continue tonight's journey, if you enjoy respectful true crime, mysterious disappearances, and fascinating stories told in a calm, relaxing way, I'd love to invite you to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes in the series. Your support helps this channel continue exploring the stories behind the places we call home. Now, let's continue. Case 2, The Midnight Knock in Gallup. On a freezing, bitter night in April 1986, the high desert town of Gallup, New Mexico, was wrapped in absolute, suffocating silence. Gallup sat in the rugged high desert country of northwestern New Mexico, surrounded by towering, rust-red sandstone cliffs that cast long, ominous shadows under the pale light of the moon. It was a region rich in coal mining history, Navajo culture, and economic hardship, where life moved at a slow, deliberate pace, and the nights felt endlessly quiet. In a modest home situated on Judy Drive, 9-year-old Anthonette Cayedito was fast asleep in her bed. She shared the small house with her mother, Penny Cayedito, and her younger sisters. It was a working-class neighborhood where doors were often left unlocked during the day, neighbors knew each other by first name, and children played freely in the dusty yards until the sun went down. Around 3 a.m. on April 6, 1986, a heavy, insistent knocking shook the front door of the Cayedito home. Penny Cayedito was fast asleep when the sound shattered the quiet of the night. She woke up abruptly, disoriented, and made her way through the dark house to the front door. She peered through the small window pane or opened the wooden door slightly to address whoever was standing outside in the freezing spring air. Standing on the porch were two men and a woman. The woman spoke first, her voice calm, clear, and chillingly deceptive. "It's me, Auntie Gonzalez," the woman said. Penny, half asleep, groggy from the sudden awakening, and trusting the familiarity of the name, believed she recognized the voice as belonging to an aunt of her children, someone who had visited before and belonged within their extended family circle. Without pausing to turn on a brighter porch light or verify the identities through the glass, Penny unlocked the heavy wooden deadbolt and pulled the door open wide to welcome her family inside. The moment the door swung wide, the comforting illusion shattered instantly. Standing on the porch were total strangers. Before Penny could process the betrayal or scream for help, the two men lunged forward with terrifying speed. They brushed past her, ignoring her presence, and zeroed in on 9-year-old Anthonette, who had woken up and walked out into the hallway to see why her mother was talking to people in the middle of the night. The intruders grabbed the little girl. One of the men hoisted Anthonette into his arms, while the other held her back as she began to struggle and cry out. The men rushed down the front steps and bolted into the pitch-black night toward a waiting vehicle parked at the curb. Penny screamed at the top of her lungs and sprinted out the door after them, but it was entirely futile. By the time she hit the street, the car's taillights were already disappearing around the corner, accelerating rapidly into the dark maze of Gallup residential streets. Law enforcement was notified immediately, and an intense, multi-agency search of Gallup and the surrounding Navajo Nation was launched within the hour. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined local police and tribal officers, combing through the Red Rock canyons, checking abandoned mining shafts, inspecting drainage culverts, and interviewing every resident within a 5-mile radius. Investigators quickly realized that no one named Auntie Gonzalez had visited the house that night. The name was not a coincidence. It was a calculated, deliberate ruse, tactical deception used by individuals who either knew the family's habits, knew Penny's voice associations, or understood how to manipulate a tired mother into opening her front door in the dead of night. For over a year, the case grew cold, swallowed by the vast, empty spaces of McKinley County. Then, roughly a year after she was stolen from her hallway, Penny Cayedito received a phone call that changed the emotional trajectory of the investigation and confirmed every mother's worst nightmare. The telephone rang late at night. Penny picked up the heavy plastic receiver with trembling hands. On the other end of the line, she heard frantic, heartbreaking crying. "Mom? This is Anthonette," a young, recognizable voice sobbed through the static. Before Penny could ask where she was, who was holding her, or what address she was at, a harsh, gruff male voice abruptly interrupted in the background, shouting with violent authority, "Who are you talking to?" Then, a violent struggle was heard over the line, a sudden scuffle, the sound of furniture scraping the floor, a sharp intake of breath, and a firm, mechanical click as the phone line went dead. The FBI traced the phone call with the best technology available at the time. However, because of the limitations of 1980s telecommunications infrastructure and the routing through various long-distance switching stations, they could only narrow the origin down to a general region in California or Nevada, thousands of miles away from the red mesas of New Mexico. It was a fleeting, agonizing glimpse into a dark reality. Anthonette was alive, somewhere out there, trapped in a world controlled by predatory men who had snatched her from her own hallway. Decades have passed since that night. Penny Cayedito has since passed away, carrying the unbearable guilt, grief, and trauma of opening her front door to her grave. Anthonette's younger sisters grew up carrying the heavy psychological weight of a sister stolen from their beds while they slept. The red rocks of Gallup still stand, silent and indifferent, hiding the truth of what happened to a little girl whose only crime was answering a knock in the dark. Case 3, The Lonely Stretch of Highway 26. In the autumn of 1991, 18-year-old Jennifer Penttila packed up her white Fuji mountain bike and a few essential belongings, leaving her home in Missoula, Montana, with a deep sense of youthful wanderlust and independence. She flew to San Diego, California, intending to experience life on the open road, relying entirely on her bicycle, her physical stamina, and her own resilience to carry her across the vast and unpredictable landscapes of the American West. For the first couple of weeks, Jennifer stayed in regular contact with her family back in Montana. She called them frequently from pay phones along her route, checking in, describing the changing desert scenery, the coastal breezes, and reassuring them that she was safe and taking precautions. By mid-October, her journey had brought her inland, down through the American Southwest, crossing the state line into the arid, sun-baked plains of New Mexico. The scenery shifted from the mild coastal climate to an unforgiving, dry landscape where towns were separated by dozens of miles of nothingness. On October 17, 1991, Jennifer made a final verified stop at a Shell service station located on Pine Street in Deming, New Mexico, a dusty, historic town nestled in Luna County near the Mexican border. From the pay phone outside the station, she placed her final telephone call to her mother in Montana. She sounded tired, as anyone riding a bicycle across desert highways would be, but her demeanor was normal. She told her mother where she was currently located and outlined her general plans for the next leg of her ride, mentioning her intention to travel up toward Las Cruces. Then, she hung up the receiver, walked back out to her white Fuji bicycle, mounted the saddle, and pedaled out into the open desert. She was never seen alive again. When Jennifer failed to make her subsequent scheduled check-ins with her family over the following days and weeks, her mother grew deeply concerned. A missing persons report was officially filed on November 1, 1991, by the Missoula Police Department, triggering a multi-state search that eventually zeroed in on the desolate, sun-bleached stretches of southern New Mexico. For months, investigators chased rumors, truck driver sightings, and dead ends. The desert terrain lying between Deming and Hatch, New Mexico, is an unforgiving expanse of alkali flats, creosote bushes, wind-blown sand, and jagged mountain ranges rising sharply from the valley floor. It is a vast, empty place where human remains can easily vanish forever, hidden by dense brush or scattered across miles of uninhabited wilderness by scavenging coyotes and wild fauna. Nearly a year later, on September 4, 1992, a group of hikers walking through a remote, rarely visited area off State Road 26 somewhere in the stretch between Hatch and Deming made a chilling discovery that shifted the nature of the inquiry. Half buried beneath a heavy, weather-beaten canvas tarp in the middle of nowhere were several personal items belonging to Jennifer Penttila. Law enforcement officers rushed to the remote desert scene. They recovered her personal effects from beneath the tarp, but there was no sign of Jennifer herself. No skeletal remains, no torn clothing, no fragments of her white Fuji bicycle frame. Just the items she had been carrying on her journey, hidden away under a tarp as if someone had dumped, cached, or deliberately buried her belongings after a violent encounter on the lonely highway. The discovery immediately transformed the missing persons case into an active homicide investigation. New Mexico State Police officers and FBI agents combed the miles of desert surrounding the tarp site. They searched deep washouts, natural arroyos, and abandoned ranch houses across Luna County. They found nothing else to indicate where her body might have been taken. State Road 26 is a notorious stretch of road long, straight, hypnotic, and flanked by miles of absolute nothingness. Investigators theorized that Jennifer may have grown exhausted in the brutal heat and accepted a ride from a passing motorist, or that she was deliberately targeted by a predator patrolling the empty highways of the Southwest looking for vulnerable travelers. Decades have come and gone since that discovery. The white Fuji bicycle has never been found. Jennifer's physical remains have never been recovered. The case sits in the archives of the New Mexico State Police Cold Case Homicide Unit, an open file waiting for the single piece of physical evidence that will explain how an 18-year-old girl riding a bicycle could simply vanish into the dust of New Mexico. Case 4: The Shadows of West Mesa. If you drive to the southwestern edge of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the sprawling city limits bleed out into the vast, undeveloped expanse of the West Mesa, you are met with an overwhelming, oppressive sense of emptiness. It is a high desert plateau of volcanic rock, wind-swept sand, and stubborn tumbleweeds, crisscrossed by dirt utility tracks and forgotten construction roads. For years, this sprawling, unlit wasteland was used informally by local residents as an unofficial dumping ground for stolen vehicles, construction debris, household trash, and broken furniture. It was also the hunting ground of a calculated serial killer. The nightmare came to light on the afternoon of February 2, 2009. A woman walking her dog across the desolate landscape near 118th Street Southwest noticed something strange protruding from the sandy soil, a small, weathered bone. She stopped, walked closer, brushed away a thin layer of topsoil, and realized with a wave of cold dread that it was human. Police were called to the scene immediately. What initially began as a grim recovery operation quickly evolved into the largest, most complex, and most disturbing archaeological crime scene in the history of New Mexico. Forensic anthropologists from multiple universities, alongside Albuquerque Police Department crime scene investigators, cordoned off a massive 92-acre zone on the plateau. Working under the harsh, glaring desert sun, sifting the fine sand inch by inch with specialized trowels and screens, they uncovered a horrifying reality: the West Mesa was a mass grave. By the time the painstaking excavation was complete, the skeletal remains of 11 women and girls had been unearthed from shallow graves scattered across the plateau. These were not women who belonged to wealthy gated communities or prominent local families. Many of them lived on the margins of society, struggling with severe substance addiction, working transient lifestyles, or caught in the dangerous, isolating web of street-level sex work in the International District of Albuquerque. Because of this, when they began disappearing one by one between 2003 and 2004, their absences had not triggered massive public panics, front-page newspaper spreads, or urgent television broadcasts. They were the less dead individuals whose disappearances were too easily overlooked, dismissed, or actively ignored by a busy, indifferent city. Yet, as the names of the victims were meticulously pieced together through DNA analysis and dental records, their individual tragedies laid bare the profound human cost of the mystery. They were daughters, mothers, and sisters whose lives were brutally stolen. Selenia Edwards, just 15 years old, a runaway from Oklahoma. Jamie Barella, 15 years old, last seen leaving a park. Michelle Valdez, 22 years old, who was 4 months pregnant when she vanished from the city streets. Cinnamon Elks, 32 years old. Doreen Marquez, 24 years old. Victoria Chavez, 26 years old. Julie Nieto, 24 years old. Veronica Romero, 28 years old. Evelyn Salazar, 27 years old. Virginia Cloven, 24 years old. Monica Candelaria, 22 years old. Every single one of them had vanished from Albuquerque between 2003 and 2004. They had all been buried in the exact same desolate stretch of dirt on the West Mesa, placed carefully into shallow graves by a killer who knew the terrain intimately, understood how to avoid detection, and felt entirely comfortable operating under the cover of the vast desert night. Autopsies and forensic examinations revealed the brutal, violent nature of their deaths. Many of the victims showed clear signs of blunt force trauma or asphyxiation, though the exact cause of death for several could not be definitively determined due to the advanced state of decomposition after years baking in the sandy soil. As the task force dug deeper into the investigation, detectives looked closely at potential suspects who fit the psychological profile of a serial predator. One name that frequently surfaced in police files was a local man named Lorenzo Montoya, a convicted felon with a documented history of extreme violence against women. In 2006, Montoya had been shot and killed by a sex worker he had viciously attacked inside his Albuquerque home. Detectives wondered if Montoya was the West Mesa bone collector, the monster who had buried 11 lives in the desert sand. He lived close to the burial site, and his sudden death coincided with the end of the disappearances. However, evidence linking Montoya directly to all 11 murders remained inconclusive and largely circumstantial. While investigators strongly suspected he may have been responsible for some of the deaths, doubts lingered as to whether a single man working alone could have maintained such a disciplined, large-scale operation without leaving a broader forensic trail, or if other perpetrators or an organized network of predators were involved. Other suspects, including a rogue police officer and individuals tied to local organized crime, were also scrutinized. To this day, the West Mesa murders remain officially unsolved. No one has ever been charged, tried, or convicted in a court of law for the deaths of these 11 women and girls. A substantial reward fund sits waiting in bank accounts, and the Albuquerque Police Department's Cold Case Division continues to field tips, but the shadow over the West Mesa remains unbroken. The families of Selenia, Jamie, Michelle, and the others are still waiting for justice. And out on the plateau, the wind still howls across the empty sand, keeping the dark secrets of a killer who walked among the bright lights of Albuquerque and vanished back into the desert night. Case 5: The Boy Who Walked into Thin Air. While the open desert highways and sprawling, sun-baked mesas of New Mexico are infamous for holding tightly onto their secrets, the state's historic, densely populated cities are not immune to baffling, terrifying disappearances. If you travel north from Albuquerque, the landscape shifts. The elevation rises, the air grows thinner and cooler, and you find yourself in Santa Fe. Santa Fe is a city unlike any other in America. It is ancient by American standards, founded in 1610, and it wears its history proudly. The city is a maze of low-slung adobe architecture, narrow, winding dirt streets, and vibrant cultural plazas packed with tourists, artists, and generations of deeply rooted families. It is a beautiful, deeply spiritual place. But even in a city so full of life and light, shadows fall long and dark. And in the early summer of 2000, Santa Fe became the epicenter of every parent's absolute worst nightmare. On June 7, 2000, the Romero family was living a normal, quiet life in a busy, close-knit residential neighborhood on the south side of Santa Fe. 7-year-old Robbie Romero lived with his mother, Evelyn, and his older brother. Robbie was a bright, deeply energetic little boy. He had dark hair, a wide, infectious smile, and the kind of boundless, restless energy that defines a 7-year-old boy in the early days of summer vacation. He was deeply loved by his family, known for being polite, playful, and fiercely attached to his mother. That evening, the intense heat of the New Mexico sun was finally beginning to break. As the sun began to lower toward the western horizon, it painted the sky in brilliant strokes of burnt orange and bruised purple, casting long, stretching shadows across the stucco and adobe walls of the neighborhood. The temperature began its steep evening drop, a familiar comfort in the high desert. It was roughly 7 p.m., that golden hour when kids are trying to squeeze in every last second of playtime before the streetlights flicker on and call them inside for the night. Robbie went to his mother and asked for permission to walk to a friend's house. This was not an unusual request. The friend lived just down the street. It was a walk Robbie had made before, an incredibly short, seemingly safe distance in a familiar neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and where children frequently played outside in the front yards and driveways. There were no busy highways to cross, no dark forests to navigate. Just a simple stroll past a few neighboring houses. Evelyn considered it, and looking out at the remaining daylight, she agreed. She watched him walk out the front door, his small sneakers hitting the pavement. She watched him start his short journey down the street, turning her attention back to the house, believing with absolute certainty that her youngest son was merely yards away, safe in the company of his neighborhood friends. But Robbie never made it to his friend's house. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the Santa Fe streets into the cool, heavy dusk, Robbie failed to return home. At first, there was likely just a prickle of parental annoyance, the thought that he had lost track of time playing video games or trading cards. Evelyn walked down the street to the friend's house and knocked on the door, expecting to find Robbie sitting on the living room floor. Instead, the friend's parents answered the door with a look of confusion. Robbie wasn't there. In fact, he hadn't been there at all that evening. He had never arrived. In a matter of seconds, annoyance evaporated into sheer, visceral panic. The kind of panic that drops the temperature of your blood and makes the world tilt on its axis. Evelyn and her family immediately began frantically searching the immediate streets, their voices cracking as they called Robbie's name into the cooling, darkening evening air. They checked the nearby yards, the parked cars, the alleyways. Silence answered them. By nightfall, the grim reality set in, and the Santa Fe Police Department was officially notified. What followed was an intensive, agonizing search operation that gripped the entire city. Within hours, the quiet neighborhood was transformed into a chaotic command center. Police cruisers blocked off the streets, their red and blue lights flashing against the adobe walls. Search and rescue dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the asphalt, trying desperately to pick up the scent of a 7-year-old boy. Community volunteers poured out of their homes with flashlights, forming long lines to sweep through the area. Above them, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of police helicopters chopped through the night sky, their massive spotlights cutting harsh white circles into the darkness below. They scoured the city of Santa Fe inch by inch. Because of the city's unique geography, there were terrifying natural hazards to consider. Searchers rappelled into the deep arroyos, the dry, jagged riverbeds that cut through the city and can easily hide a fallen child. They broke into abandoned buildings, sifted through heavy commercial dumpsters, and trekked into the rugged, brush-choked canyons that border the city limits. Detectives immediately began knocking on doors, pulling people from their beds to interview neighbors. They pulled the registries for local sex offenders, tracking down every known predator living within a 50-mile radius, demanding alibis and searching vehicles. Hundreds of tips flooded into the police station switchboards from people who thought they had seen a little boy matching Robbie's description. Yet, despite the massive, overwhelming law enforcement response, and despite the sheer number of people living in the immediate vicinity where Robbie vanished, they found absolutely nothing. No one saw what happened to him. There were no witnesses who reported seeing a child pulled into a vehicle. There were no screams heard, no sounds of a struggle, no discarded shoes or torn clothing left behind on the sidewalk. Robbie Romero had simply walked out of his home, stepped onto his own street, and evaporated into thin air in the span of a few minutes. In the weeks and months that followed, as the initial shock wore off and the harsh reality of a cold case set in, the investigation took several dark, deeply frustrating turns. In true crime, there is a brutal, statistical reality. When a child vanishes, the police must first look inside the home. It is standard, albeit agonizing, procedure. Detectives began to look closely at Robbie's own family. The intense, unforgiving spotlight of police suspicion temporarily fell heavily on Robbie's older brother, Ronnie, who was a teenager at the time. The pressure applied to the family was immense. Detectives subjected the teenager to grueling interrogations, pushing for inconsistencies in his timeline of that evening. Eventually, law enforcement officials took the drastic step of publicly stating to the media that they believed the older brother knew more than he was sharing. This accusation shattered the family's world all over again. It led to a deeply fractured, hostile relationship between the grieving family and the police department meant to be helping them. The media descended, and the court of public opinion was vicious. Neighbors whispered. Fingers were pointed. However, the police's theory lacked one vital component: evidence. No concrete physical evidence, no blood, no fibers, no witnesses, no digital trail ever linked the older brother, or anyone else in that house, to Robbie's disappearance. The family steadfastly and fiercely denied any involvement whatsoever, enduring unimaginable grief under the harsh, unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. They were forced to mourn the loss of a child while simultaneously defending themselves against accusations of murder. Years slowly turned into decades. The small, adobe-lined streets of Santa Fe continued to bustle with tourists buying turquoise jewelry and dining in upscale restaurants. The world moved on. But for Evelyn Romero, time permanently stopped on the evening of June 7, 2000. Her home became a shrine to a little boy frozen in time. Today, if you look on the databases of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, you can find Robbie's profile. You will see the photo of the smiling 7-year-old boy. Right next to it, you will see the age-progressed photos, painstakingly created by forensic artists, showing what Robbie might look like as a grown man in his 30s. It is a haunting, heartbreaking visual of a life that was stolen. To this day, the fate of Robbie Romero remains entirely unknown. The theories are endless, but the facts are non-existent. Was he snatched by an opportunistic predator passing through the neighborhood in a car, a monster who saw a small boy walking alone and seized a horrific crime of opportunity? Did he wander off and fall victim to the harsh New Mexico wilderness, his remains hidden deep in an undiscovered arroyo? Or did something far more sinister, and far closer to home, occur in the quiet evening hours? The files remain open. The detectives who originally worked the case have retired, passing the dusty boxes down to a new generation of investigators. But the answer to how a little boy could walk down his own street and vanish off the face of the earth remains hidden in the deep, quiet shadows of Santa Fe. Case 6, Cindy Rivera's disappearance in Las Vegas. When you hear the name Las Vegas, your mind almost certainly jumps to the blinding neon lights, the sprawling casinos, and the chaotic, synthetic energy of the Nevada Strip. But there is another Las Vegas, an older, much quieter one. Tucked away in the forested, high-altitude foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the historic town of Las Vegas, New Mexico, is a place suspended in time. It boasts stunning, perfectly preserved Victorian architecture, old railroad hotels that echo with frontier history, winding brick-lined streets, and a quiet, old-world charm that feels worlds away from the flat, sun-baked desert plains of the state's southern half. The air here is thinner, smelling sharply of pine needles and wood smoke. It is a tight-knit community where families have lived for generations, bound by deep cultural roots and the isolating geography of the rugged northern mountains. But beneath its picturesque, postcard-perfect surface lie quiet tragedies that have never found resolution. The sprawling forests that surround the town are dense, dark, and unforgiving, the perfect place to hide a secret forever. On the weekend of June 30, 2012, that beautiful, mountainous landscape became the backdrop for a chilling mystery. 44-year-old Cindy Rivera, affectionately and universally known to her friends, family, and the local community by her lifelong nickname, Tig, disappeared under deeply suspicious and entirely unexplained circumstances. Cindy was not a transient traveler or someone living on the margins of society. She was a deeply entrenched, beloved member of the Las Vegas community. Known for her brilliantly outgoing personality, her infectious laugh, and her fierce dedication to her family, Cindy was the kind of woman who lit up a room. She was a mother who maintained a relentless, daily line of communication with her children. Whether it was a quick text message to check in, a phone call to finalize dinner plans, or a drop-by visit, her children were the absolute center of her universe. To those who knew her, the idea of Cindy voluntarily walking away from her life, her home, and her kids was not just unlikely, it was utterly impossible. The timeline of her final known movements is maddeningly brief. On that late June day, as the New Mexico summer heat settled over the valley, she was last seen at a residential property located on Peggy Lane. Peggy Lane is a quiet, unassuming stretch in the Las Vegas area. It appeared to be a completely normal summer day, or so it seemed to outside observers. There were no immediate signs of distress, no frantic calls for help to 911, and no reports of a violent altercation. And then, she simply stopped existing in the daily routines of her family and friends. The digital footprint that tracks our modern lives, cell phone pings, bank transactions, social media activity, went entirely cold. When evening fell and she failed to contact her relatives, a ripple of unease passed through her family. When the next day arrived with still no word, that unease morphed into absolute, paralyzing terror. This behavior was entirely out of character for the devoted mother. Knowing in their bones that something was terribly wrong, her family grew frantic and officially filed a missing persons report with the New Mexico State Police. The response was swift and massive. Investigators fanned out across San Miguel County, treating the case with immediate, grave urgency. Law enforcement understood that in the crucial first 48 hours of a disappearance, the rugged terrain of northern New Mexico is as much an enemy as any human suspect. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains are filled with steep ravines, abandoned mining claims, dense thickets of timber, and miles of unpaved, desolate logging roads. Search and rescue teams combed through the heavily wooded terrain surrounding the mountain town. Police interviewed the residents living along Peggy Lane and the surrounding streets, trying to piece together a timeline. They checked local motels, scoured through abandoned buildings, and deployed specialized tracking dogs. What made Cindy's disappearance so uniquely terrifying to her loved ones and so deeply frustrating to the detectives working the case was the utter, chilling lack of physical evidence left behind. In cinematic mysteries, there is usually a clue, a dropped set of keys, a vehicle found idling on a dirt road with the door open, a purse tossed into a drainage ditch, or signs of a violent struggle inside a home. Real life, in the case of Cindy Rivera, offered none of that. Her personal effects, the things a woman needs to survive and navigate the world, were not found abandoned in a dramatic fashion. She simply walked into a house on Peggy Lane and never came back out. It was a vanishing so clean, so abrupt, and so clinically executed that it left investigators with virtually nothing to swab for DNA, nothing to test in a lab, and no definitive physical trail to trace. Because of the abruptness of her disappearance and her absolute devotion to her children, the New Mexico State Police classified her case as endangered from the very outset. They did not entertain the theory that she had run away to start a new life. Investigators suspected early on that foul play was intimately and directly involved in her vanishing. More disturbingly, law enforcement strongly suspected that this was not the work of a random, roaming predator. They believed that people within her immediate circle, people who lived in that very town, who walked those same brick-lined streets, knew exactly what had happened to her. But when police began to press for answers, a heavy, suffocating wall of silence quickly went up. In small, close-knit communities, allegiances run deep. Fear of retaliation, deep-seated family loyalties, and a historic distrust of outside authorities can cause witnesses to lock their doors and close their mouths. Despite intense interrogations and public pleas from Cindy's devastated children, the people who held the keys to the mystery refused to speak. Hoping to shatter that wall of silence, authorities and desperate family members managed to put together a staggering financial incentive. A substantial cash reward reaching up to $50,000 was offered for any information leading to her exact location, the arrest of those responsible for her disappearance, or the recovery of her remains. $50,000 is a life-changing amount of money for almost anyone. In many cold cases, a reward of that magnitude is enough to break criminal alliances or convince a guilt-ridden witness to finally make an anonymous phone call. But as the years have dragged on without a single break in the case, the tips have slowed to a miserable trickle. The $50,000 reward has gone unclaimed, proving that whoever is holding on to the secret of what happened to Cindy Rivera is either terrified beyond the temptation of money, or entirely devoid of a conscience. The silence has become deafening. Today, the houses along Peggy Lane still stand in the cool, crisp mountain air. Life in Las Vegas has moved forward, the seasons changing the colors of the leaves on the trees, the snow falling and melting on the historic plazas. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains continue to loom over the town, watching over the narrow streets like ancient, silent sentinels that refuse to give up what is buried in their soil. Her family is still waiting for a phone call that may never come, trapped in the torturous limbo of ambiguous loss. Cindy "Tig" Rivera remains a ghost, a vibrant, deeply loved woman whose name is now whispered in police briefing rooms and permanently etched onto cold case registries, waiting in the dark for someone, somewhere, to finally break the silence and bring her home. If you're still with me tonight, thank you. A quick like lets YouTube know to share it with other true crime fans, and I'd love to hear in the comments where you're listening from, or which state you'd like us to visit in a future episode. Case 7, The Mountain Crossover of Judy Smith. While many of the chilling disappearances we have explored originate entirely within the harsh borders of New Mexico and vanish into its vast expanses, other mysteries feature a terrifying, inexplicable geographic twist. These are the cases of individuals who vanish thousands of miles away on the complete opposite side of the country, leaving behind frantic families and baffled urban police departments, only for their final resting place to be discovered in the rugged, unforgiving wilderness of the Land of Enchantment. There is perhaps no case in modern American history that embodies this terrifying phenomenon quite like the baffling journey of Judy Smith. In April 1997, 50-year-old Judy Smith was living a comfortable, deeply rooted life in Newton, Massachusetts. She was a dedicated home healthcare nurse, a profession that requires immense empathy, strict organization, and reliability. She was known to her friends, colleagues, and patients as a dependable, loving mother and a consummate professional. She was not a risk-taker, nor was she someone prone to spontaneous, reckless decisions. Her life was anchored by her family and her work. On April 9, Judy accompanied her husband, Jeffrey, a prominent attorney, to the bustling, historic city of Boston. Jeffrey was attending a medical/legal convention at a downtown hotel, and Judy decided to use the time to enjoy a miniature vacation. That crisp spring morning, Judy told her husband she was going sightseeing. She planned to visit the local tourist attractions, perhaps walk the Freedom Trail, and explore the historic, densely packed city streets of downtown Boston while he attended his scheduled meetings. She walked out of their hotel room, stepped onto the crowded Boston pavement, and vanished. When evening fell, the city lights flickering on against the chilly New England sky, Jeffrey returned to the hotel. The room was empty. Initially assuming she had simply lost track of time browsing shops or enjoying a long dinner, he waited. But as the hours ticked by and the night deepened, cold dread began to set in. He contacted the local authorities, triggering a massive missing persons search in the heart of one of America's most densely populated urban environments. The Boston Police Department mobilized quickly. Investigators checked underground transit hubs, scoured hospital emergency rooms, searched local parks, and interviewed hotel staff. They pulled whatever limited security footage existed in 1997. The search was frantic and thorough. Boston is a city where it is incredibly difficult to simply slip away unnoticed. You are constantly surrounded by pedestrians, traffic, and noise. Yet, Judy had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth without leaving a single verifiable footprint behind. For months, her family lived in an agonizing, paralyzing state of limbo. Missing person posters featuring Judy's warm smile were plastered across New England transit stations, storefronts, and telephone poles. Her loved ones desperately searched for answers in a case that defied logical explanation. Then, nearly 5 months later, on September 7, 1997, the answer to where Judy was finally surfaced, but it was an answer that made absolutely no sense. More than 2,000 miles away from the paved streets of Boston, a group of hunters was hiking through the remote, high-altitude terrain of the Sandia Mountains. The Sandias are a rugged, heavily forested mountain range towering just east of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The terrain here is treacherous, characterized by steep granite drop-offs, dense alpine timber, and unpredictable weather that can shift from scorching heat to freezing cold in a matter of hours. Resting in a heavily wooded, incredibly difficult-to-access canyon, far off any main recreational trails, the hunters made a gruesome discovery: the skeletal remains of a human being, partially covered by the brush and exposed to the harsh elements. Law enforcement officers from the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, alongside specialized forensic experts, hiked into the rugged terrain to process the scene. The location was so remote that investigators marveled at how anyone not intimately familiar with the mountains could have navigated there. Scattered nearby in the dirt and brush were several personal items that immediately struck detectives as out of place in the wild. A distinctive watch. A blue backpack containing $167 in cash. Airline ticket receipts. Scattered fragments of winter clothing. Through meticulous dental records and subsequent DNA testing, authorities confirmed the horrifying, mathematically impossible reality: the skeletal remains belonged to Judy Smith. The discovery sent absolute shockwaves through her grieving family and completely baffled federal and local investigators alike. The geographic leap was staggering. How did a 50-year-old home healthcare nurse from suburban Boston, who had vanished from a crowded downtown sidewalk in April without her luggage, end up dead in a rugged mountain canyon 2,000 miles away in the American Southwest? Investigators furiously retraced every possible step, diving headfirst into a rabbit hole of bizarre theories. The investigation revealed a labyrinth of unanswerable questions. The transit mystery: did she board a plane voluntarily? There were no records of a Judy Smith booking a flight out of Logan International Airport that day, and while airport security in 1997 was more relaxed than it is today, flying cross-country still required identification and resources. The abduction theory: did someone abduct her in broad daylight in Boston and transport her across the entire continental United States against her will? If so, why kill her and dump her in such a difficult-to-reach location in New Mexico, rather than somewhere along the vast, empty highways of the Midwest? The fugue state: did she experience a sudden, severe psychological break or a dissociative fugue state, causing her to forget her own identity, abandon her life, and travel to New Mexico of her own accord? Adding to the utter bizarre nature of the case, several witnesses in the Albuquerque area later came forward claiming they had interacted with a woman matching Judy's exact description in the weeks following her Boston disappearance. The most compelling sighting came from a clerk at a local Albuquerque boutique. The clerk told police that a woman who looked identically like Judy had come into the store, acting highly disoriented and paranoid. The woman purchased several items of hiking clothing. But if this was indeed Judy, why was she in Albuquerque? How had she survived the weeks between April and her ultimate death? And who, if anyone, was she with? When forensic anthropologists examined her remains, they hit yet another wall. Autopsy reports were unable to determine a definitive cause of death due to the advanced state of decomposition, months of exposure to the extreme mountain elements, and extensive animal scavenging. Investigators found no obvious, undeniable signs of severe skeletal trauma such as bullet holes or blunt force fractures that would definitively point to a homicide. Yet, the circumstances of her death in such a remote, treacherous area strongly suggested she did not die peacefully. It was not a place a novice hiker would accidentally wander into, nor was she properly equipped for a major alpine expedition. Today, the mystery of why Judy Smith left Boston, how she crossed the entire American continent without drawing attention to her true identity, and how she ended up dying in a rocky crevice in the Southwest remains completely unsolved. If you stand in Albuquerque at dusk and look east, the Sandia Mountains rise majestically over the city. True to their name, Sandia means watermelon in Spanish. Their steep limestone cliffs glow a brilliant, bloody pink in the setting sun. It is one of the most beautiful sights in the Southwest. But beneath those ancient trees, high up in the cold granite canyons, the wind carries the memory of a woman who walked out of a hotel in Massachusetts and ended up lost forever in the New Mexico pines. Case 8: The White Sands Mystery of Albert and Henry Fountain. To fully understand that New Mexico has always been a landscape capable of swallowing people whole, we must look back much further than the paved highways and forensic laboratories of the 20th century. We have to travel back to the winter of 1896, during the turbulent, bloody territorial days of the American frontier. Long before it was the land of enchantment, the New Mexico Territory was a beautiful, lawless expanse where political disputes were often settled not with gavels, but with Colt revolvers, and where the desert was vast enough to hide 1,000 sins. At the center of this dangerous world was Albert Jennings Fountain. Fountain was no ordinary citizen, he was a towering figure in Southwestern history. A fiercely intelligent, prominent attorney and powerful political player, Fountain was a former Civil War veteran who had fought bravely for the Union. His reputation was legendary. He was perhaps best known across the Southwest for serving as the defense attorney for the infamous outlaw Billy the Kid during his 1881 murder trial. By 1896, Albert Fountain had evolved from a frontier lawyer into a highly influential, unyielding member of the territorial legislature. He was a man of strict principles, and he was waging a fierce, uncompromising political and legal war against powerful syndicates of cattle rustlers who were operating with sheer impunity in southeastern New Mexico. These rustlers were not mere petty thieves, they were wealthy, heavily armed, and politically connected barons who ruled the plains through intimidation and violence. In January 1896, Fountain packed his bags and traveled to the mountain town of Lincoln, the historic, bullet-riddled epicenter of the bloody Lincoln County War. His mission was highly dangerous. He was there to secure grand jury indictments and prosecute several influential, dangerous men for illegal cattle branding and large-scale rustling. He did not make the journey alone. He brought along his youngest son, an innocent, bright-eyed 8-year-old boy named Henry, for company. According to historical accounts, Fountain's wife, Mariana, had been gripped by a terrible premonition about her husband's safety. Knowing the violent men he was up against, she insisted he bring little Henry along on the grueling journey. She was operating under a desperate, deeply flawed assumption: surely, even the most ruthless cattle rustler or hardened frontier criminal would never dare ambush and harm a man who was traveling in the open company of a small, innocent child. It was a fatal miscalculation of the frontier's absolute brutality. On January 30, 1896, Albert and Henry Fountain hitched their horses to an open buckboard wagon and left Lincoln. The winter air was bitterly cold, biting through their heavy wool coats as they headed south across the freezing desert plains toward their family home in Mesilla, near Las Cruces. The journey was supposed to take several days across some of the most isolated, desolate stretches of land in North America. They never made it home. The creeping dread began on the second day of their journey. On February 1, as the buckboard wagon approached the desolate, windswept region known as Chalk Hill, a lonely rise situated near the edge of what is now the sprawling, blindingly white dunes of White Sands National Park, Fountain stopped his horses to speak with a passing stagecoach driver heading in the opposite direction. Fountain's demeanor was grim. He told the driver that 3 suspicious, heavily armed men on horseback had been trailing his wagon at a steady, deliberate distance for miles across the Alkali Flats. They were always there, looming on the horizon, keeping pace, waiting for the perfect moment. The stagecoach driver, intimately familiar with the violent reputation of the local rustler gangs and the absolute isolation of the road ahead, recognized the deadly peril. He pleaded with Fountain to abandon his route. He urged him to turn his wagon around immediately, join the stagecoach, and seek safety in the nearby town of Tularosa. But Albert Fountain was a proud, stubborn man who had survived the battlefields of the Civil War. Confident in his political standing, fiercely protective of his son, and armed with a Winchester rifle resting beside him on the wagon seat, Fountain politely declined. He pressed forward into the freezing wind, believing he could outrun the danger and make the journey safely if he just kept moving toward home. That brief conversation with the stagecoach driver was the last time anyone ever saw Albert and Henry Fountain alive. When days passed and the Fountains failed to pull into their driveway in Mesilla, panic swept through the territory. Search parties were quickly organized by concerned citizens, Fountain's political allies, and territorial authorities. Heavily armed posses of men on horseback rode out into the desert, tracking the distinctive grooves of Fountain's buckboard wagon wheels to the desolate flats of Chalk Hill. The scene they finally encountered was straight out of a frontier nightmare. The buckboard wagon was found abandoned in the dirt, tilted and ransacked. Its contents, legal documents, camping gear, and personal effects were scattered wildly across the freezing sand, as if a frantic struggle had taken place. The horses had been cut loose and were completely gone. More horrifyingly, large, dark patches of human blood heavily soaked the desert sand around the site. The sheer volume of blood indicated a brutal, close-quarters ambush had taken place in the open desert, and that at least one of the fountains had been severely wounded or killed on the spot. Footprints and horse tracks told a chilling, silent story. The fountains had been intercepted, dragged from their wagon, and taken away by force into the sprawling expanse of the dunes. An exhaustive, aggressive manhunt was immediately launched. It was led by none other than the legendary Dona Ana County Sheriff Pat Garrett, the very lawman who had famously tracked down and killed Billy the Kid 15 years earlier. Garrett was relentless. He and his deputies scoured the alkali flats, dug into the shifting sands, and interrogated ranchers across the territory. Yet, despite Garrett's legendary tracking skills and the massive territorial response, the bodies of Albert and Henry Fountain were never found. The investigation quickly zeroed in on a powerful local cattle baron and bitter political rival named Oliver M. Lee, along with several of his heavily armed, deadly associates, including Jim Gilliland and William McNew. Oliver Lee was a wealthy, highly influential rancher who utterly despised Albert Fountain. More importantly, Lee possessed a massive motive. He had been legally indicted for cattle rustling by Fountain just days before the murders took place. The case escalated into a legendary, politically charged legal battle that completely consumed the New Mexico territory. Warrants were issued, but Lee and his men evaded capture for years, hiding out in their remote ranch strongholds. After years of fleeing justice and even engaging in a dramatic, bloody shootout with Pat Garrett on a canyon roof, Oliver Lee finally surrendered and stood trial for the murder of little 8-year-old Henry Fountain. It was the trial of the century for the Southwest. It was a sensational, high-stakes showdown that pitted powerful political bosses, territorial governors, and the most elite defense attorneys in the country, including future Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, against one another in a sweltering, tense courtroom battle. However, the prosecution faced a massive, insurmountable legal hurdle. In the late 19th century, forensic science was non-existent. Without the actual bodies of the victims to definitively prove a homicide had even occurred, the legal principle of corpus delicti, securing a capital murder conviction in front of a sympathetic, heavily intimidated local jury in southern New Mexico, was nearly impossible. The defense argued that Albert and Henry Fountain could have simply run away to Mexico. It was an absurd theory, given the blood at the scene and Fountain's dedication to his family, but it was enough to plant the seeds of reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes before returning to the courtroom and acquitting Oliver Lee of all charges. All other related indictments against his associates were subsequently dropped. The men walked out of the courthouse free. Oliver Lee lived out the remainder of his life as a respected local politician, a wealthy rancher, and a pillar of the community. He died peacefully in his bed at the age of 76, having never spent a single day behind bars for the brutal ambush at Chalk Hill. To this day, more than a century later, the disappearance of Albert and Henry Fountain remains an open, bleeding wound in New Mexico lore. Their bones have never been recovered. The white gypsum dunes of White Sands are a place of haunting beauty, but they are not static. They shift and move constantly in the desert wind, burying the past beneath miles of blinding, pristine white sand, keeping the true story of what happened on that freezing February afternoon locked away forever. Case 9, The Hunt That Never Ended. To the southwest of Albuquerque, far beyond the suburban sprawl and the flat highway corridors, lies one of the most untamed, primordial expanses of wilderness remaining in North America, the Gila National Forest. Encompassing over 3 million acres of rugged timberland, ancient volcanic canyons, and towering mountain ranges, the Gila holds a special place in American conservation history. In 1924, thanks to the vision of legendary naturalist Aldo Leopold, a vast swath of this forest was officially designated as the country's very first protected wilderness area. It is a place of breathtaking, primeval beauty. Ponderosa pines stretch hundreds of feet into the mountain air, their roots tangled in volcanic soil that has remained virtually untouched by modern civilization for centuries. Deep granite gorges cut through the forest floor, carved over millennia by cold mountain streams. But the Gila is as unforgiving as it is magnificent. There are no paved roads cutting through its wilderness heart, no cell phone towers standing on its high peaks, and no easy exits if you lose your way. When the sun dips behind the Mogollon Rim, the forest is plunged into a darkness so absolute that the mountains themselves seem to swallow the horizon. It was into this endless sea of green and granite that 61-year-old Melvin Nadel stepped in mid-September 2009. Melvin was not a reckless amateur wandering ill-prepared into the mountains. He was an experienced, seasoned woodsman, an accomplished bow hunter, and a former law enforcement officer who knew the outdoors intimately. He lived in Arizona, but the lure of New Mexico's autumn elk hunting season had brought him east across the state line to the Black Range, a jagged, heavily timbered mountain chain on the eastern edge of the Gila Wilderness near the town of Winston. On Thursday, September 17, 2009, the weather in the Black Range was classic early autumn high desert, crisp, clear morning air giving way to mild afternoon sunlight filtering through the canopy. Melvin and his longtime hunting partner hiked deep into the forest near the North Seco Peak area, establishing a position on a ridge to glass for elk. They were equipped with high-end camouflage, GPS units, water, and survival gear. They understood the terrain, understood the risks, and were operating within a familiar, comfortable routine. Around 4 p.m., as the afternoon shadows began to stretch across the forest floor, Melvin signaled to his hunting partner that he was going to step away for just a few moments. He left his heavy hunting pack resting against a tree trunk and set his compound bow, his primary hunting weapon, carefully beside it. He was dressed in full camouflage clothing, carrying only his sidearm in a chest holster, his wallet, and his cell phone. He told his partner he was merely walking a short distance into the pine thicket to relieve himself, expecting to be back at the stand in less than 10 minutes. He turned, walked past a stand of dense timber, and disappeared from his partner's line of sight. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then half an hour. Knowing Melvin's discipline and experience, his hunting partner initially assumed he had spotted an elk or was quietly stalking game further down the ridge. But as 45 minutes ticked by without a sound breaking the forest silence, concern set in. The partner stood up, walked to the spot where Melvin had vanished into the trees, and began calling his name. Only the echo of his own voice bouncing off the granite cliffs answered him. The partner searched the immediate area frantically, tracking what little sign he could find in the pine needles, but Melvin was nowhere to be found. Recognizing that daylight was rapidly fading, he hiked out of the wilderness to raise the alarm. By nightfall, local authorities, the Sierra County Sheriff's Office, and the New Mexico State Police were notified. What followed was one of the most extensive, technologically advanced, and emotionally exhausting search and rescue operations in the history of southwestern New Mexico. Within 24 hours, the tranquil solitude of the Gila Wilderness was replaced by the roar of search operations. Dozens of highly trained wilderness searchers, professional mountain trackers, and volunteers on horseback swept through the North Seco Peak region. Specialized search and rescue dogs were flown in, their handlers hoping the hounds could pick up Melvin's scent from his abandoned hunting pack. Above the trees, military and police helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared, FLIR, thermal imaging technology flew grid patterns over the canopy late into the freezing mountain nights, scanning the forest floor for the heat signature of a human body. Yet, day after day, the wilderness yielded absolutely nothing. The tracking dogs, despite starting from the exact location where Melvin had left his bow and pack, were unable to establish a clear scent trail. It was as if his physical presence on the mountain had simply ceased the moment he stepped behind that stand of timber. Searchers rappelled into treacherous, hidden ravines and explored dark granite caves. They combed through miles of dense brush, checking every natural trap, dry creek bed, and blowout where an injured man might take shelter from the elements. There were no skid marks in the dirt to suggest a fall down a steep slope. There was no discarded gear, no spent shell casings from his sidearm fired as a distress signal, no torn fabric from his camouflage clothing caught on the thorns of a mountain bush, and no blood to suggest an attack by a mountain lion or bear. Investigators analyzed every logical scenario. The medical event: could a 61-year-old man have suffered a sudden, catastrophic stroke or heart attack? Yes, but even if he had collapsed, his body would have remained on or near the trail where he stepped away, easily spotted by the dozens of ground searchers and air units. An animal attack, predatory attacks by mountain lions or black bears in the Gila do happen, but they leave behind undeniable, gruesome forensic evidence: drag marks, blood trails, broken equipment, or scattered clothing. None existed. Foul play or accidental shooting: was he accidentally shot by another hunter who panicked and concealed the body? Or did he encounter someone in the remote wilderness who wished him harm? While theoretically possible, moving a human body through that rugged, roadless terrain without leaving a trace for tracking dogs or mountain searchers would have been nearly impossible. After weeks of continuous, exhaustive effort, the official search was reluctantly scaled back. The Gila had claimed another victim, swallowing a seasoned law enforcement officer and outdoorsman without leaving behind a single piece of evidence to explain his fate. Melvin Nadel's disappearance remains one of the most perplexing cold cases in the annals of New Mexico missing persons. His family was left with the torturous reality that a beloved husband and father had walked a few steps away from his friend on a clear autumn afternoon and simply ceased to exist. If you hike into the Black Range today, near the shadows of North Seco Peak, the forest looks exactly as it did on that September afternoon in 2009. The towering ponderosa pines still sway gently in the mountain breeze, dropping their needles onto the dark earth below. The mountain air is clean and quiet. But beneath that peaceful wilderness canopy lies an eerie, unanswerable mystery, a reminder that in the vast, untamed wilderness of New Mexico, a single step off the beaten trail can be the step that takes you out of this world forever. Case 10, The Silent Plains. New Mexico is, at its very core, a land defined by stark, breathtaking extremes. Its natural beauty is raw, vast, and entirely uncompromising. It is a place where the cracked, red earth meets the massive dome of the sky in a blinding, punishing display of afternoon sunlight. It is a state where ancient, dormant volcanic mountains look down with indifference on millions of acres of empty brush, and where the silence of the high desert night is absolute, broken only by the distant, lonely howl of a coyote or the rush of the wind through the pinyon pines. But for those who have lost someone to this sprawling wilderness, that same silence is unimaginably heavy. It is not the comforting quiet of a peaceful night, it is an oppressive, suffocating silence that carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. It is a deliberate silence that stubbornly refuses to answer the desperate, weeping pleas of mothers, fathers, siblings, and families left behind to wonder. It is the silence of ambiguous loss, a grief without a grave, a mourning without an end. The landscape remembers the tragedies that humans have tried to bury, even as the world continues to spin and society tries to move on and forget. The earth holds the echoes of the missing. It holds the memory of a driven young woman who rode her neon-pink bicycle down the shoulder of Old Highway 6 into the morning sun, leaving behind only the haunting, unresolved nightmare of a Polaroid photograph found thousands of miles away. It remembers the terrifying midnight knock in Gallup, the deceptive voice in the dark, and the little girl snatched from her hallway while her mother was only steps away. It guards the lonely stretch of Highway 26 in Luna County, where a cross-country traveler's journey ended violently, her personal belongings tucked beneath a heavy canvas desert tarp to hide a predator's tracks. The West Mesa still overlooks the sparkling, bustling night lights of Albuquerque, forever stained by the memory of the 11 marginalized women and girls whose lives were stolen and discarded beneath the blowing sand, their killer slipping back into the anonymity of the city. The narrow, ancient adobe streets of Santa Fe still wind through the foothills, holding tightly to the secret of a smiling 7-year-old boy who asked to walk to a friend's house and simply evaporated in the golden hour of the evening. The high-altitude pines of the Sandia and Sangre de Cristo ranges whisper the names of Judy Smith and Cindy Rivera, women whose fates are locked in the cold, granite canyons and deep, forested valleys where search dogs lose the scent and human eyes cannot penetrate. And far to the south, the brilliant, blinding white gypsum dunes of the Tularosa Basin shift endlessly in the wind, rolling over the historic bloodshed of 1896, keeping the remains of a father and his 8-year-old son buried deep beneath a sea of white. In police precincts and sheriff's departments across the state, the cold case files remain open. Stacks of yellowing paper, digitized forensic reports, and old photographs sit on detectives' desks. New generations of investigators inherit the mysteries of the past, picking up the magnifying glass, waiting for the advent of new DNA technology, a sudden confession, or a shift in the desert dirt to finally yield the answers. But until that day comes, the mysteries belong to the landscape. The long, empty highways stretch on into the infinite horizon, cutting a black ribbon through the dark. The wind blows across the alkali flats and the rugged mesas, carrying the dust of centuries and the secrets of the lost. The night is vast, the stars are cold and clear, and the desert is entirely still. Thank you for spending part of your evening with me. I hope tonight's story gave you a deeper appreciation for the people who sought the truth, and compassion for the families whose lives were forever changed. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, I'd be honored to have you join me again. Next time, we'll journey to another state, and discover another story. Every night has a story.